The Spanish Inquisition killed way fewer people than you think. Like embarrassingly fewer for an organization that spent 350 years perfecting the art of religiously motivated sadism. We're talking maybe 3,000 to 5,000 executions over 3.5 centuries, which breaks down to about 10 to 15 people per year across an entire country. Your local DMV probably has a higher body count. But here's the thing nobody tells you. The killing wasn't really the point. The point was the terror, the spectacle, and creating a surveillance state so paranoid it would make the NSA blush. So it's 1478 and Spain has a problem. They just finished the Reconquista after 700 years of kicking Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula, and now they've got this freshly unified Christian kingdom full of converts they don't trust. Specifically, they're worried about conversos Jews and Muslims who converted to Christianity because the alternative was exile or death, which is definitely how you get sincere believers. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, yes, the same ones who funded Columbus because they wanted him to fuck off and find India somewhere else, went to Pope Sixtus IV and basically said, hey, can we get permission to torture people to verify their faith? And the Pope, demonstrating the theological wisdom we've come to expect from the Catholic Church, said, yeah, sure, why not? Thus began the only Inquisition that was controlled by a monarchy instead of the church, which is like letting the police investigate themselves. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Enter Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor, and a man whose name has become synonymous with religious fanaticism, despite the fact he probably wasn't even the worst guy in this story. Spoiler, the bar was underground. Torquemada was Isabella's personal confessor, and he convinced the monarchs that conversos were secretly practicing Judaism in their basements like some kind of medieval crypto Jews. He was so paranoid about Jewish influence that he was basically the 15th century equivalent of your uncle who won't shut up about conspiracy theories at Thanksgiving. The darkly hilarious part? Torquemada himself was of converso descent. His grandmother was a converted Jew. So he spent his entire career overcompensating for his own ethnic background by persecuting people like himself, which is a level of self-hatred that would require years of therapy, if therapy existed back then. Under his leadership, the Inquisition expelled all Jews from Spain in 1492, somewhere between 40,000 to 200,000 people depending on which historian you ask, none of whom were having a great time. Here's what made the Spanish Inquisition special. It wasn't a mob with pitchforks. It was a highly organized bureaucracy with paperwork, procedure, and a legal framework that would make modern lawyers weep with envy. When the Inquisition came to your town, they'd announce an Edict of Grace, a 30-day period where you could confess to heresy and get off relatively easy, which is basically a medieval plea bargain. If you didn't confess during the grace period and someone later accused you, congratulations, you just unlocked hard mode. The Inquisition kept meticulous records of everything. Accusations, testimonies, torture sessions, they called them questions, confessions, all of it. They had forms, they had protocols, they had quality control. This wasn't passionate religious violence. This was industrialized paranoia with filing systems. They even had a manual called the Directorium Inquisitorum that laid out exactly how to conduct investigations, what questions to ask, and how much torture was appropriate. Turns out there was a scale for that, which is absolutely not concerning at all. The Monty Python sketch lied to you. People absolutely expected the Spanish Inquisition. In fact, they gave you 30 days notice before your trial, which is more warning than you get before a surprise IRS audit. But here's the fucked up part. You didn't know who accused you, what specifically you were accused of, or who testified against you. The trial was secret, the evidence was secret, the witnesses were secret. It was like being prosecuted by a grand jury that operates entirely on anonymous Yelp reviews. And the accusations could be anything. You didn't eat pork, suspicious if you're a former Jew or Muslim. You changed your clothes on Saturday, Jewish Sabbath, very suspicious. You washed your hands before praying, Muslim practice, believe it or not, also suspicious. Or, and this is my personal favorite, you showed insufficient enthusiasm during Mass. Imagine getting tortured because someone thought you looked bored during church. Most accusations came from neighbors, rivals, jealous business competitors, or that one family member who still pissed you inherited grandma's house. The Inquisition basically weaponized community pettiness and gave it legal authority. Let's talk about the torture, because you came here for the torture. The Inquisition had three main techniques, used in escalating order, and all of them were designed to extract confessions without leaving permanent marks, because they were considerate like that. First up, the garrucha, or strappado, where they tied your hands behind your back, attached you to a rope, and hoisted you into the air. Then they drop you suddenly and stop you right before you hit the ground, dislocating your shoulders in the process. Think bungee jumping, but if the bungee cord hated you personally. Second, the toca, or water torture, which is exactly what it sounds like. They'd strap you to an inclined board, stuff a cloth in your mouth, and pour water over your face until you felt like you were drowning. Waterboarding has been around for 500 plus years, and we still pretend it's enhanced interrogation instead of just calling it torture like honest people. Third, and by far the worst, the rack, el potro, where they'd stretch your body in opposite directions until your joints separated and your ligaments tore. The Inquisition's version had a special twist. They'd attach cords to your limbs and tighten them progressively, which is somehow more precise and therefore worse than the standard medieval rack. Here's the thing though, they kept detailed records of torture sessions, and most people confessed before they even started. The threat was usually enough, which tells you exactly how terrifying the reputation was. So you've been tortured, you've confessed, everyone confessed eventually, that's how torture works, and now comes the auto da fe, literally act of faith, which is the most Orwellian naming since the Patriot Act. This was a public ceremony where the Inquisition would parade the condemned through the streets wearing a San Benito, a yellow tunic with red crosses that marked you as a heretic, before announcing your sentence in front of thousands of people. It was medieval reality TV, and the entire town would come out to watch. Most people got penances, public humiliation, fines, confiscation of property, which conveniently funded the Inquisition, no conflict of interest there. Some got exile. The unlucky ones got relaxed to the secular arm, which is bureaucratic speak for we're going to burn you alive, but we're going to let the government do it, so technically the church's hands are clean. If you recanted at the last minute, they'd be merciful and garrote you before burning your corpse, which is the most medieval version of at least we're not monsters I've ever heard. The burnings happened outside city limits because the church didn't want blood spilled on sacred ground, which is some real mental gymnastics when you're literally executing people for not believing hard enough. By the early 1500s, the Inquisition had evolved into something beyond religious enforcement. It became thought police with ecclesiastical authority. They banned books, monitored correspondence, and encouraged people to report suspicious behavior in their neighbors, friends, and family. They created an environment where everyone was potentially guilty, and proving innocence was impossible because how do you prove what you believe in your heart? The answer is you can't, so you just perform Christianity as publicly and enthusiastically as possible and hope nobody notices that time you didn't cross yourself quite right. The Inquisition published an index of forbidden books that banned everything from Protestant theology to scientific works to fictional literature they deemed immoral. Cervantes' Don Quixote almost made the list, which means we nearly lost one of the greatest novels ever written because some inquisitor thought windmills were an inappropriate metaphor or whatever. They inspected incoming ships, monitored printing presses, and had informants in every major city. The fear wasn't just that you'd be caught doing something heretical. The fear was that you'd be accused of thinking something heretical, which is considerably harder to defend against. The Spanish Inquisition lasted until 1834, which means it survived longer than the Roman Empire and persisted through the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. Let that sink in. You had steam engines and the Spanish Inquisition existing at the same time. By the 1700s, the Inquisition had become mostly irrelevant, burning the occasional blasphemer or Freemason to remind everyone they still existed, like that washed-up celebrity who shows up on reality TV. The last execution was in 1826 when a schoolteacher named Cayetano Ripoll was hanged for being a deist, basically believing in God but not organized religion, which is the theological equivalent of it's complicated. Napoleon actually tried to abolish the Inquisition when France occupied Spain, which is wild because this means Napoleon fucking Bonaparte, the guy who crowned himself emperor, looked at the Spanish Inquisition and went, okay, this is too much even for me. The Inquisition was officially abolished in 1834 during a liberal government reform, and Spain just kind of quietly moved on like those 350 years didn't happen. So what's the final tally? Maybe 150,000 people prosecuted over 350 years? Around 3,000 to 5,000 executed. Tens of thousands tortured, exiled, or financially ruined. An entire Jewish population expelled from Spain, decimating the intellectual and economic fabric of the country for centuries. The creation of a culture of fear and suspicion that taught people to hide their thoughts, distrust their neighbors, and perform belief rather than feel it. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't the deadliest thing in history. Colonial violence, the 30 Years' War, and pretty much any modern genocide killed way more people. But it was arguably the most successful at creating lasting psychological trauma across generations. The conversos who stayed lived in constant fear. The Jews who left scattered across Europe and North Africa, carrying that trauma with them. Spain itself became culturally isolated, missing out on the scientific revolution and Renaissance humanism because they were too busy checking if people were secretly Jewish. The Inquisition turned neighbor against neighbor, weaponized faith, and proved that bureaucratic evil with proper paperwork is somehow more terrifying than passionate mob violence, because it means someone sat down, thought about this, wrote procedures, and decided this was the right thing to do. The Spanish Inquisition is a case study in what happens when you combine religious certainty with state power, add a healthy dose of ethnic paranoia, and systematize the whole thing with bureaucratic efficiency. It wasn't the cartoonish villain organization that Monty Python turned it into, and it wasn't as deadly as the Crusades or the witch trials. What made it special was the longevity and the mundane administrative approach to persecution. These weren't wild-eyed fanatics running through the streets. These were salaried officials with job security and pension plans who clocked in, tortured some people, filed their reports, and went home to dinner. The Spanish Inquisition ended almost 200 years ago, but we still use it as shorthand for religious oppression and thought control, which tells you something about its cultural impact. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, the sketch goes, but actually everyone should have expected it, because when you give people the authority to police belief instead of behavior, to punish thoughts instead of actions, and to define truth by orthodoxy instead of evidence, you get the Inquisition. Or you get whatever modern equivalent we're currently pretending isn't the same thing. History doesn't repeat, but it sure as hell rhymes, and if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of those 500-year-old screams.